He went rigid, not the practiced stillness of a man at attention, but something deeper, the kind of stillness that comes when the floor of your understanding drops out from under you. Lieutenant Ryan Cole stared at me across the ballroom, and I watched 28 years of training fail him for exactly 1 second. He mouthed the word before he said it, night watch. I gave him a single nod. Small, almost nothing. It was everything. To understand why a decorated Navy SEAL was looking at me, a woman his own commanding officer's daughter, a woman he'd been told for months was just an intelligence pusher, a desk girl, like I was something out of a legend whispered in debrief tents. You have to go back 6 weeks. Back to a folding table covered in a paper tablecloth, 3 bowls of mashed potatoes, and my father's voice filling a dining room the way it always did, completely and without apology. My father, Colonel Frank Whitfield, United States Army, retired, believed the world divided cleanly into 2 kinds of people. There were warriors, and there was everyone else. He had spent 31 years making sure everyone at his table understood which kind he was, and, more importantly to him, which kind I wasn't. Family dinners were his favorite arena for that particular lesson, a place where he could refight his glory days over mashed potatoes and gravy while the rest of us nodded along. He talked about grit the way other men talk about weather, constantly, and as though he'd personally invented it. Courage, to him, was a purely physical thing, something you could measure in miles marched and doors kicked in. He had no vocabulary at all for the kind of courage that looks like sitting perfectly still in a dark room, making a decision that will haunt you either way, and never getting to tell anyone what it cost you. So Gracie. He said it the way he always did mid-chew, mid-monologue, turning to me only after he'd finished telling Ryan Cole about a firefight outside Fallujah that had gotten a little more heroic with each of the 400 times I'd heard it. "What'd you do today? Move some spreadsheets around?" It wasn't a question. It was a punchline he'd been building toward since 1987, and I was the only one at the table who never laughed at it. "Something like that, Dad," I said, and passed the green beans. I could have told him the truth. That 6 hours earlier, I had been sitting in a windowless room 40 feet underground, watching a live feed from a Reaper drone 11,000 feet over a mountain range in a country he couldn't find on a map without help making a call that would decide whether 11 soldiers came home tonight. I could have told him that. I never did. I'd learned that a long time ago. The truth just gave him more ammunition to explain, patiently, why it still didn't count. Ryan didn't laugh either. He never did. That was the thing about Ryan Cole that made him different from the version of him my father had constructed in his head. My father saw a Navy SEAL Lieutenant Silver Star, the boy he'd basically adopted the day they met at a fundraiser 18 months ago, and built a whole mythology around him. The son he never had. The tip of the spear, he called him, at least twice a week, usually while looking pointedly at me. I was the shaft in that metaphor. Not that he'd ever said it that plainly. He didn't have to. There was a photograph of Ryan on our mantelpiece. Glossy, official. The kind the Navy sends out for press. It sat next to my father's own medals in a frame nicer than the frame around my parents' wedding photo. My master's degree, Georgetown Security Studies top of my class, was in a box in the attic wrapped in a garbage bag to keep the damp off, because my mother had put it there for safekeeping before she got sick and never got the chance to hang it herself. I thought about that box a lot. More than I thought about the mantelpiece. "You know," my father said, reaching for the gravy, not looking at me, "your mother used to say you'd find your way eventually. I keep telling her." He stopped. He always stopped there. 3 years since we lost her, and he still slipped into present tense like she was in the next room, and every time it happened, his face did something complicated that I never quite knew how to read. I reached over and squeezed his hand, quick, before he could notice I'd noticed. "I know, Dad." My mother, Elaine, had been the translator between my father and the rest of the world for as long as I could remember. She was the one who softened his edges at parent-teacher conferences, who explained to relatives that he didn't mean it like that, who sat beside me on the porch the night I got my acceptance letter to Georgetown and told me quietly that my father had cried reading it in the garage where he thought no one could see him, and had come inside afterward and said only, "She'll need a good coat for winters up there." That had been the whole conversation. My mother had translated it for me anyway, patient as always. "That's him saying he's proud, Grace. That's just what it sounds like coming out of him." I hadn't believed her, not really. not for years. It had always seemed like too generous a reading of a man who found so many other ways to make his pride visible for everyone except me. That was the deal I'd made with myself the week after the funeral, standing in a hospital hallway that smelled like burnt coffee, holding my mother's hand while it went cold. She hadn't said much at the end. The morphine took most of her words before it took the rest of her. But she'd found enough breath for one sentence, gripping my wrist harder than I thought she had strength left for. Don't let it break the family, Grace. Whatever happens, he doesn't know how to say it right. Doesn't mean he doesn't mean it. So I kept coming to the dinners. I kept passing the green beans. I kept being Gracie's spreadsheet girlkeeper of tidy databases in a bunker somewhere near Maryland because that was the promise. And because some part of me, the part that still missed her so much, some mornings I had to sit in my car in the parking garage for 10 minutes before I could make my face work right, believed that if I just held on long enough, my father might eventually see me, not perform for him, see me. I hadn't given up on that, not yet. That's not the same thing as being naive about it, whatever people want to believe. Ryan Cole caught my eye across the table while my father refilled Ryan's glass without being asked. There was something in Ryan's face, had been on and off all evening, that I couldn't place. A flicker, like he'd heard a song before and couldn't remember where. You okay? I asked him quietly, while my father was busy retelling the Fallujah story to my aunt, who had definitely heard it before, too. Ryan blinked, like he was coming back from somewhere. Yeah, sorry, you just... He shook his head. Your voice? It's dumb. Never mind. Try me. There's it. He laughed it off, but it wasn't a real laugh. There's someone I used to work with. Never met her face to face. You sound like her a little. Forget I said anything. I smiled and let it go because I had learned over 11 years in this line of work exactly how to let things go on my face while a completely different set of gears turned somewhere underneath it. I knew exactly who he meant. I'd have bet my career on it. The rest of that dinner went the way it always did. My father moved on to a story about a training exercise in 1994, and my Aunt Carol asked me kindly if I was seeing anyone, and I said no, work was busy. Which was true, and also the same answer I'd given for 3 years running. My cousin's kids ran through the living room twice, chasing a dog that didn't belong to any of us. Somewhere in there, my father refilled everyone's wine except mine, because he still, after 11 years, forgot that I didn't drink much before an early shift, and I still, after 11 years, didn't correct him. I helped my aunt clear plates afterward the way I always did, standing at the sink, with dish soap up to my wrists while my father held court in the living room, his voice carrying easily through the thin wall between us. I could hear him telling Ryan about the time he'd led a convoy through a stretch of road. Everybody called ID Alley, and I could hear Ryan's polite practice questions in response, the questions of a young officer who respected his elders and had learned the way all of us eventually learn exactly how much of himself to hold back in rooms like that one. My aunt dried a plate beside me, quiet for a while, and then said, without looking at me, "You know he talks about you when you're not here." I almost dropped the glass I was holding. Does he? Tells people you work in intelligence. Says it like it means something. She set the plate in the cabinet, careful, precise. He just doesn't know how to say it to your face. Some men only know how to be proud of you behind your back. It's not right, but it's real, Grace. I didn't say anything to that. I didn't trust myself to. I just kept washing dishes until the water ran cold, and thought about how strange it was that my father's pride, when it existed at all, seemed to require my absence to survive contact with the air. But that's getting ahead of things. To understand what happened at that dinner table, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living and how far apart they'd grown. To my father, my job was a rumor, Air Force. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, ISR, though he'd never once used the term correctly. Some bunker in Maryland, he told his VFW buddies, waving a hand like he was shooing a fly off a picnic table. Database analyst. Proud of her, of course. The truth was that I was a major in the United States Air Force assigned to a Distributed Common Ground Systems site, DCGS, the actual backbone of American drone intelligence. The place where raw sensor feeds from predators and reapers around the world get turned into decisions that keep soldiers breathing. My call sign, among the handful of people who used it, was Night Watch. I hadn't chosen it. Nobody chooses their own call sign. That's not how it works, and it's one of the smaller lies my father's war movies had taught him. Night watch had been given to me 18 months earlier by a ranger platoon sergeant who'd never seen my face, only heard my voice through a scrambled channel at 3 in the morning while his squad walked unknowingly straight into what should have been the last 5 minutes of their lives. The center where I worked didn't look like anything from Frank Whitfield's war stories. No mud, no mountains, a windowless room, cold enough that we kept jackets on our chairbacks year-round, lit by the blue glow of 100 monitors and the occasional red blink of a priority alert, quiet enough that you could hear someone 2 rows over clear their throat. That was where I was in command. Not the metaphorical kind of command my father respected, the kind you can see, photograph, put on a mantelpiece. The kind where a 3-star general trusted my read on a grainy thermal feed more than his own gut, because my read had a better track record than his gut did. My direct commanding officer was Brigadier General Marcus Hale, a man who had exactly 2 facial expressions, focused and more focused, and who had never once in 3 years of working under him asked me a single question about my father, my family, or where I'd come from. He asked me one kind of question over and over: what do you see? Hale had come up through a different world than my father's, a world of sensor fusion and pattern-of-life analysis, of decisions made in fractions of a second, based on shapes and heat signatures rather than the sight of an enemy's face. He didn't respect rank the way my father did, as a kind of trophy case. He respected accuracy. In 3 years, I had watched him dress down a full colonel for a sloppy assessment with the exact same flat, unhurried tone he'd used to correct a brand new second lieutenant, and I had watched him listen, actually listen, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, to a 23-year-old airman first class whose read on a situation turned out to be sharper than his own. That was the culture Sam Wynn and I lived inside, 6 days a week, in a room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and cold electronics. Sam had come to the unit 2 years after me, straight out of intelligence training, all nervous energy and rapid-fire questions during her first month. And I'd watched her grow into someone whose instincts I trusted almost as much as my own. She kept a small collection of novelty erasers on her desk shaped like tiny drones, a joke gift from a friend that had somehow become a tradition, with new ones arriving every birthday, and she talked to herself under her breath while she worked a running commentary that had become over 2 years, oddly comforting background noise. "You ever notice," she said to me once, months before any of this started, staring at a satellite pass that was taking its time updating, "how nobody outside this building has any idea we exist? Like, actually exist." My mom still tells people I do computer stuff for the government, which, I mean, technically. But it's like we're a rumor that occasionally saves people's lives. Better a useful rumor than a famous mistake, I told her, and she laughed at that. And it had become something of a running joke between us. Better a useful rumor, repeated on the hard nights when the work felt invisible even to the people it was protecting. I remember the night Operation Silent Compass nearly went wrong, because it's the night that set everything else in motion. We had a ranger element moving through a valley in eastern Afghanistan, tracking a high-value courier network that had been feeding intelligence back to a cell responsible for 3 roadside bombings in the preceding month. 11 men on the ground. My screen, my call, the primary feed, the wide-angle overhead that gave us eyes on the whole valley, dissolved into static without warning. Enemy jamming, we found out later, more sophisticated than anything we'd seen from that network before. The room went from the ordinary hum of concentration to something heavier, suffocating almost. General Hale's hand landed on the back of my chair. "Talk to me, Night Watch." I had a secondary feed, a narrower, lower resolution angle from a second platform that had been repositioning for refuel. It wasn't much, it was something. "Ground team's on a bearing of 220, I said, watching the thermal signatures crawl across my screen, my voice level even though my pulse wasn't. "That's wrong. Based on last confirmed terrain features, they should be at 195. They've drifted." Drifted into what? I pulled the terrain overlay, cross-referenced it against a pattern of life report we built over 3 weeks of watching that valley. My stomach dropped half a second before my mouth caught up. There's a wash, a dry riverbed, at their current heading. Elevated ground on both sides. If I had ground to hide a squad in an ambush position in that valley, that's where I'd put it. "You're guessing." "I'm reading the ground the way the ground's been read for 3 weeks straight, sir. I don't like the guess. I like it less than the alternative." Hale didn't hesitate, which was one of the things I respected most about him. "Get them redirected." I keyed the secure channel myself. Protocol usually routed it through a liaison, but there wasn't time for protocol. Any station, this is Night Watch. Be advised, come right to 195 immediately. Repeat, come right to 195. Possible ambush position at your current heading, elevated ground, both flanks. Silence, 2 seconds. 5. In that room, 5 seconds is a geological age. Night Watch, this is Cutlass 2. Copy, coming right to 195. A pause, static crackling. What are you seeing that we're not? Trust the redirect, Cutlass 2. Confirm when you're clear. 30 more seconds. The secondary feed flickered, resolved. I watched 11 heat signatures alter course, climb out of the wash, put 200 meters of open ground between themselves and whatever had been waiting for them in that riverbed. My own drone, the one whose feed had come back online just in time, caught the secondary confirmation a minute later. 6 additional signatures, stationary, dug into the exact position I'd flagged, weapons visible once the angle cleared. Cutlass 2, Night Watch, you're clear. Confirmed hostile element at your previous heading. Nice night to not be there. There was a beat of radio silence and then a voice, rough with something that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite relief. Copy that, Night Watch. We owe you a drink. We're never going to be able to buy you. That was Ryan Cole's voice. I didn't know it yet, wouldn't put the name to it for weeks, but I'd remember it. You remember the voices of people whose lives you've held in your hands, even when you never see their faces. General Hill put a hand on my shoulder for exactly as long as it takes to say 4 words. Good call, Major. Then he walked back to his desk, because in that room, that was the whole ceremony. No applause, no medal ceremony with a live band, just the quiet exhale of 11 men who got to keep breathing, and a 3-star general who trusted me enough not to need to say more than that. I sat there for another minute after the room's tension released, staring at my own hands on the keyboard, thinking about my father's face when he asked me, once a week, what battles I'd fought from behind a desk today. I never had a good answer for him. I had a good answer for the 11 men in that valley. That had to be enough. For a long time it was. The dinner where everything cracked open happened 3 weeks after Operation Silent Compass at a fundraiser for a veteran support charity my father chaired, the kind of event with a cash bar, a lot of faded dress uniforms, and just enough self-importance in the room to power a small city. I went because I always went. Because of the hallway. Because of my mother's hand going cold in mine. My father held court near the bar the way he always did, Ryan Cole planted at his side like a trophy he personally won. An old friend of his, a man I vaguely recognized from a Christmas party a decade back, nodded toward me. That your girl, Frank? What's she up to these days? My father laughed. That particular laugh, the one I'd have recognized in a lineup of 1,000 laughs, the one that meant dismissal dressed up as affection. Her? She pushes pixels for the Air Force. Database work out of some office near DA. See, we're proud, of course. He leaned in, dropping his voice into that conspiratorial rumble he used when he wanted a joke to land harder, gripping Ryan's shoulder like he was introducing a prize bull at auction. Now this fine lieutenant here, this is a real warrior. Men like him are why the rest of us sleep easy. He looked right at me when he said the next part, smiling, certain he was being charming. Taliban wouldn't lose a wink of sleep over a daughter like you, sweetheart. The room did that thing. Rooms do. A beat of silence just a half second too long. A couple of uncomfortable chuckles from men who didn't know where to look. My face didn't move. I'd had a lot of practice keeping my face from moving. But something in my chest went very cold and very still, the way it does right before I make a call I know I can't take back. Ryan Cole didn't laugh. His jaw tightened, and for a moment his eyes flicked toward me, not with pity, which is what I'd braced for, but with something closer to alarm. Like my father had just said something dangerous without knowing it. Like he understood on some level he couldn't yet name that the man he idolized had just insulted someone he had personal, specific reasons to respect. My father's friend, the one who'd asked the question that started it all, shifted his weight, uncomfortable now, sensing he'd wandered somewhere he hadn't meant to. Now, Frank, I'm sure she does important work too, he offered, the kind of correction that isn't really a correction at all, just a softer version of the same dismissal. Oh, I know, my father said, waving a hand, already moving on to refill his glass. All I'm saying is there's warriors and there's everybody else keeping the lights on for 'em. Both matter. Just different weight classes, you know? He said it like he was being generous, like he'd found a fair, balanced way to describe something he'd never once tried to understand. I thought, standing there with a half-empty glass of club soda sweating in my hand, about the 11 men from 3 weeks earlier. Cutlass too. And the 6 additional signatures dug into a riverbed they never got the chance to open fire from. I thought about how easily that different weight class could have become 11 flag-draped coffins if I'd been 30 seconds slower reading a degraded thermal feed. I said none of it. There was no version of saying it out loud in that room at that moment that would have landed as anything other than defensive sensitive. Exactly the things my father had spent 11 years quietly training me to believe I was whenever I tried to push back. I excused myself before I trusted my voice. Driving home that night, I kept waiting for the anger to hit. The loud, useless kind, the kind that would have felt at least honest. It never came. What came instead was quieter and colder and, in its way, more dangerous. Clarity. I thought about 11 years of trying to reach my father through the language he'd never once let me use. The language of feelings, of hurt, of please see me. It had never worked. It was never going to work. My father didn't speak that language. He never had. What my father spoke, what he built his entire identity around, the thing he genuinely, truly revered, was rank, protocol, ceremony. The visible architecture of respect that the military had spent 31 years teaching him to worship. So I decided, somewhere around a red light I don't remember stopping at, that I would finally speak to him in the only dialect he'd ever fully understood. The Air Combat Command Distinguished Achievement Gala was 5 weeks out, an annual event semi-public in the way these things usually are, a guest list heavy with active and retired officers. A handful of vetted press restricted to a pool report and citations that for classified operations get read from carefully sanitized summaries. Enough detail to honor the work, not enough to compromise it. I was scheduled to be one of 3 officers receiving a Distinguished Service Commendation that year for my role in what the official record would call Operation Silent Compass. I sat with that fact for 2 days before I did anything about it. Then I went to see Master Sergeant Diane Okafor. Diane ran base security clearance verification the way some people run a Sunday church service, with total unshakable authority and zero patience for anyone who thought they could rush her. I'd known her for 4 years. She was the only person on base who could make a 3-star general wait in a hallway without apologizing for it. I need 2 guests added to the gala list, I told her. My father, and a Lieutenant Ryan Cole, currently attached to. I gave her his unit designation. She didn't look up from her screen right away. Your father's clearance status? Retired 11 years. Whatever, he had lapsed a long time ago. Now she looked up. So we're talking full re-verification, background refresh, sponsored justification, the whole packet. That's not a same-day thing, Major. How long? If nothing flags, and Colonel Frank Whitfield, Career Army, probably won't. Call it 10 days, maybe 2 weeks if AFOAC's backed up, which they usually are this time of year. She studied my face for a second longer than the question required. You want to tell me why you're doing this the hard way when you could just invite him as a civilian +1 and skip half this paperwork? I hadn't told anyone the real reason yet. I told Diane because Diane had a way of making silence feel like it cost you something. Because if he comes as a +1, he sits in the back and claps for someone else's name. I need him in the room when they say mine. I need it to be real. Official. Something he can't wave off as pixels and spreadsheets. Diane's expression didn't soften exactly, but it shifted into something I'd only seen a handful of times. Respect, held at a professional distance. I'll get the packet moving today. No promises on the timeline. And Major, for what it's worth, I hope it lands the way you need it to. Sometimes these things surprise you, not always in the direction you're braced for. The 10 days that followed were some of the longest of my career, and I have sat through operations measured in agonizing 30-second increments. Every morning, I checked the clearance portal before I checked my mission queue. On day 6, the packet flagged for additional review, nothing serious. Just a records mismatch on an old duty station. And I spent 4 hours convinced the entire plan was going to collapse under its own bureaucracy before it ever had the chance to mean anything. On day 9, Diane texted me one line, cleared. Both of them. You're doing the right thing, Whitfield. I think. I sat in my car in the parking garage for longer than the message required. I hadn't told Samwin the full plan yet either, but she'd guessed most of it by then. Sam had a way of reading a room, or a person, faster than most censor packages I'd worked with. Sam was 26, sharp enough that I'd already started grooming her for a lead analyst slot, and possessed of an irreverence that the DCGS floor badly needed. "You're really doing it," she said, watching me stare at my monitor without actually reading anything on it. "The gala thing. I'm really doing it. For what it's worth." She spun her chair to face me fully. "This isn't about getting back at him, right? Because if it's revenge, it's gonna feel hollow no matter how good the room looks. It's not revenge." I turned the thought over as I said it, testing whether it was still true. I don't need him to feel small. I felt small enough for both of us for a long time. I just need him to see the actual shape of what I do. Once. Just once, clearly, without a joke attached to it. Sam nodded slowly. "You know what gets me? Out there," she jerked a thumb toward the door, toward the world beyond the DCGS floor, toward men like my father. "They think anybody who's not carrying a rifle and a photograph isn't really in the fight. Like, there's no such thing as an unimportant link. You ever seen an anchor chain, Major? Every single link matters. Doesn't matter which one's closest to the ship." Sorry, I've been rehearsing that one. Wanted to use it eventually. "Use it whenever you want," I told her. "It's a good line." I called my father 2 days later to tell him about the gala. I didn't tell him it was for me. I let him assume, because he assumed instantly and with total confidence, that I was inviting him to watch Ryan Cole receive some honor. "I knew that boy was destined for something big," my father said, his voice booming with a pride I had never once heard him aim in my direction. "Course we'll be there. Wouldn't miss it for the world." I hung up the phone and sat very still for a long moment, feeling something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite satisfaction, occupying a strange, unnamed space in between. The night before the gala, I couldn't sleep, so I did what I always did when sleep wouldn't come. I drove to the base, badged into an empty DCGS floor at 11 at night, and sat in the dark with the hum of idle servers for company. Sam found me there an hour later. I hadn't asked her to come, and she didn't explain why she had. "You scared?" she asked, dropping into the chair next to mine. "I don't get scared of operations. This isn't an operation, Major. This is you, Dad." She said it gently, which was rare for Sam, and it landed harder for the gentleness. "It's allowed to be different. It's allowed to scare you a little." I thought about my mother's hand in mine, going cold, her voice down to almost nothing. "Don't let it break the family." "Whatever happens." "What if it does break something?" I said, quieter than I meant to. "What if there's no version of tomorrow night where he doesn't just shut down, get angry, decide I embarrassed him instead of understanding anything at all?" Sam didn't have a neat answer for that, and I respected her for not pretending she did. "Then it breaks," she said finally. "And you'll have told the truth anyway, and the 11 guys from Silent Compass will still be alive, and that'll still matter, whatever your dad does with it. You don't control how people receive the truth, Major. You only control whether you tell it." We sat with that for a while, the servers humming their steady, indifferent hum around us, the kind of sound that had become more familiar to me over 11 years than almost any other in my life. "Can I ask you something?" Sam said eventually. "And you don't have to answer if it's too much. Go ahead. Your mom. Would she have wanted this? The gala, the whole reveal? Or would she have told you to just let him keep thinking what he thinks and save yourself the risk?" I turned the question over for longer than I expected to need. "She used to say he didn't know how to say things right, not that he didn't mean them. I think." I stopped, started again, feeling my way towards something I hadn't fully articulated even to myself yet. "I think she'd have wanted him to finally get the chance to say it right, even if it took something like this to make him capable of it. She always believed there was more in him than what came out of his mouth at dinner." I don't know if I believe that the way she did, but I think I owe it to both of them to find out. Sam nodded slowly and didn't push further, which was its own kind of gift. I didn't sleep that night either, but somewhere around 3 in the morning, staring at the dark bank of monitors that had become the truest home I had, I stopped being afraid of what my father might do with the truth, and started just being ready to give it to him. The gala was held in a hotel ballroom 2 hours from base, the kind of venue with chandeliers that had clearly been chosen to make retired colonels feel like they were still important, which, to be fair, most of them were or had been. A limited press pool stood roped off near the back, cameras with long lenses trained on the stage rather than the crowd. Security was tight but not oppressive. Officers and their families moved through with the particular blend of pride and stiffness that these events always seemed to generate. Diana Kafour was there too, near the credential table, running one last check against the guest manifest out of habit rather than necessity. She caught my eye across the room and gave me the smallest possible nod, the nod of a woman who had spent 10 days fighting a records mismatch on my behalf and had earned the right to watch how the story ended. I nodded back, and for just a second some of the tightness in my chest eased. Whatever happened in the next hour, at least the machinery underneath it had been built honestly, one verified signature at a time. Sam found me near the stage entrance, adjusting the collar of my dress uniform with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of someone who had clearly appointed herself my personal staff for the evening. "You look terrifying," she said approvingly. "In a good way. In a do not question this woman's judgment way. That's the idea. Hey." She caught my sleeve before I could step away, her voice dropping out of its usual rapid-fire register into something steadier. "Whatever he does tonight, your dad, it doesn't change what's true. You know that, right? You didn't need this room to make Silent Compass real. It was already real. This is just the room finally catching up." I squeezed her hand once because I didn't trust my voice yet and went to find my seat. My father wore his old dress uniform, technically against regulation for a retiree at a semi-civilian function, but nobody was going to tell Frank Whitfield that tonight of all nights. He looked, I'll admit, genuinely happy, genuinely proud. It had been a long time since I'd seen that expression on his face pointed anywhere near our family, and some small, stubborn part of me ached at how good it felt to be standing near it, even knowing what I knew about where the next hour was going to take him. Ryan Cole stood beside him in his own dress uniform, and he looked like a man walking into a room he could sense was wired to blow, without knowing exactly where the charge was placed. His eyes kept finding me across the ballroom, and each time, that flicker I'd noticed weeks earlier grew a little sharper, a little more certain. I was near the stage in my own dress uniform, oak leaves on my shoulders, catching the light, hands clasped behind my back the way I'd trained myself to stand years ago. My father caught sight of me and gave a small, distracted wave, the kind you give a hostess or a coat check girl. In his mind, I was there to usher people to their seats. It would be the last time he'd ever look at me that way. General Hale approached the podium as the room settled, and a particular kind of silence fell over it. The silence of a few hundred people who understood on some level that whatever was about to be said mattered. "Good evening," Hale began. "Tonight we recognize service that, by its nature, rarely gets recognized in public. Some of what I'm about to describe has been summarized for this setting. The full record remains classified and will stay that way. But the outcome is a matter of record, and the outcome is 11 American soldiers who came home." I watched my father's posture straighten with anticipation. He put a hand on Ryan's arm, ready to nudge him to his feet the moment his name got called. He was so certain. He'd built this entire evening in his head weeks ago, and nothing about Hell's opening had shaken that certainty yet. 6 weeks ago, a Ranger element operating in a contested valley lost primary overhead surveillance mid-operation, Hale continued. Enemy jamming had blinded their support. They were on a heading that would have taken them directly into a prepared ambush position. Based on the sanitized after-action summary available to this audience, I can tell you that a secondary analyst working from a degraded feed and pattern of light data built over 3 weeks of sustained observation made the call to redirect that element in real time with less than a minute's margin for error. I watched Ryan's face change. The color went out of it slowly, the way it does when a memory you've kept sealed away suddenly gets a key turned in its lock. His hand tightened on the armrest of his chair until his knuckles went pale. He wasn't hearing a story. He was reliving one. "That analyst's call is the reason 11 men are alive today," Hale said. "Her call sign is known, informally, to a small number of operators who owe her their lives. Tonight, for the first time, this command recognizes her by rank and by name." My father's face was a portrait of pure, uncomplicated pride aimed entirely at the wrong soldier. He tightened his grip on Ryan's arm, half rising already, ready to be the proud, almost father, standing when his almost son's name got called. "Major Grace Whitfield," General Hale said, "known to the men she brought home as Night Watch." There was a fraction of a second, I will remember it for the rest of my life, where the entire room simply held its breath. Then Ryan Cole shot to his feet so fast his chair nearly went over, snapping into the crispest attention I have ever seen a human body produce. His eyes locked on me, his face a raw mixture of awe and something close to fear. And then the room erupted. I walked toward the stage with my eyes fixed on my father because some part of me needed to watch this happen in real time. Needed proof that it was real and not another version of a hope I'd been carrying for 11 years and was about to lose all over again. His face collapsed in stages. First confusion, his smile frozen, not yet understanding what it was supposed to be reacting to. Then denial, his eyes flicking from me to Hale, to the applauding room and back, his mind visibly refusing the data it was being handed. And then, as I climbed the 2 steps to the stage and shook General Hale's hand, something else moved across his face, something I had genuinely never seen there before, in 34 years of being his daughter. Understanding. Total, undefended understanding, arriving about 30 years too late to stop the sentence he'd said to me at the bar 3 weeks earlier, but arriving nonetheless. The applause took a long time to fade, and when it finally did, the quality of the silence that replaced it was different from anything that had come before it in that room, heavier, full of a truth that had just been said out loud for the first time in front of witnesses who mattered. From the stage, I could see the whole ballroom with a clarity I don't think I'd ever had in my life. Colonels, generals, men my father had spent 3 decades quietly worshiping from a respectful distance at reunions and fundraisers and every BFW hall he'd ever walked into. They were looking up at me now, forming, unprompted, into a loose line toward the stage. One by one, they shook my hand. Their words were short, and none of them wasted on flattery. They talked about the 11 men, about the intelligence I'd fed into 3 other operations that quarter that nobody in that room but Hale and a handful of others would ever know the details of, about their particular kind of trust that operators put in a voice on a radio they've never seen a face to match. An older colonel I didn't recognize held my hand a beat longer than the others, his eyes wet in a way he made no effort to hide. I lost men in a valley very much like the one they described tonight, he said, his voice low, meant only for me. 1991, we didn't have anybody like you watching. I want you to know what it means that men like mine have you now, even if I never will again. He let go of my hand, nodded once, and stepped back into the crowd before I could find any words that felt adequate in return. Diane Okafor caught me near the edge of the receiving line, out of uniform propriety, for just long enough to squeeze my arm. 10 days of paperwork, she said. And I'd do every single one of them again just to watch that man's face when General Hale said your name. Worth it, Whitfield. Every bit of it. Thank you, I told her, and meant it more than the 2 words could really carry, for not letting the packet die on day 6. I don't let paperwork die, she said, deadpan, already turning to go handle some other minor crisis. I let it suffer, and then I make it comply. Each handshake was its own quiet, complete answer to every condescending pat on the hand my father had ever given me across a dinner table. My father stayed in his seat through most of it. Not stone-faced. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. He wasn't performing dignity, wasn't hiding behind pride. He looked, for possibly the first time in his adult life, genuinely lost. Small, in a way I had never once seen him allow himself to look, watching the entire architecture of respect he'd spent his career building rearrange itself around a daughter he'd spent 11 years failing to see. Ryan Cole came to me after the officers thinned out. Gone was the easy swagger my father had spent months admiring. What stood in front of me instead was a subordinate addressing a superior, spine straight, voice thick, eyes not quite steady. Ma'am, he cleared his throat once, hard. We had no idea. I had no idea. I had no idea. I've thought about that night probably every week since it happened, and I never once. He stopped, started again. Thank you for everything. I don't know how else to say it. You don't have to say it more than that, I told him, and meant it. It wasn't validation from my father that I'd needed, standing there. It was this, a soldier whose life I'd helped save, understanding, finally, exactly what that had cost and meant. That was enough on its own. It would have been enough even if nothing else in that room had changed. He nodded once, sharp, and stepped back. That left my father. The crowd had thinned by then, the last of the well-wishers drifting toward the bar, And the space between us, maybe 15 feet of hotel ballroom carpet, felt like the widest distance I'd ever had to close in my life. He stood up slowly. For a moment, I genuinely didn't know what was coming. An apology, an excuse, another joke, deployed as armor, the kind of deflection I'd watched him perform my whole childhood whenever something threatened to actually touch him. Instead, my father, Colonel Frank Whitfield, 31 years Army, a man who had built his entire identity on the visible architecture of military respect, drew himself up to his full height and raised his hand in a slow carver, deliberate, entirely correct salute. To me, I don't think either of us breathed for the several seconds it lasted. It wasn't the salute of a father congratulating a daughter. It was the salute of a soldier recognizing a superior officer executed with the same precision he'd have given a 4-star general, because in that moment, in the only language he had ever fully trusted, that was precisely what I was. He didn't say anything. Not sorry, not I was wrong, not any of the words that a different kind of story might have needed from him to feel complete. My mother had been right about him all those years ago, gripping my wrist in a hospital hallway. He doesn't know how to say it right. Doesn't mean he doesn't mean it. He lowered his hand, held my eyes for one more moment, and then turned and walked out of the ballroom alone. His back straight, his steps even, not fleeing. Retreating maybe, the way a soldier retreats from ground he's realized he never actually held. I let him go. There are some things you don't chase down a hallway. Some truths need room to breathe before either person can do anything useful with them. Samwyn found me a few minutes later, holding 2 glasses of something sparkling she'd clearly liberated from a passing tray. She didn't say anything about my father. She just handed me a glass and stood beside me, watching the last of the crowd disperse. "Told you," she said eventually, quiet enough that it was just for me. "No such thing as an unimportant link." I laughed, a short, surprised sound, half relief and half something rawer underneath it. "You did tell me that. I'm always right. It's exhausting, honestly." 18 months later, I stood at the window of an office that overlooked a runway, watching a transport aircraft climb into a sky the color of a healing bruise, orange bleeding slowly into a deep, settled blue. I was a lieutenant colonel now. The promotion had come through 9 months after the gala, on a timeline that made sense, that had taken the years of work behind it seriously, rather than skipping past them because a good story needed a shortcut. I'd earned the Silver Oak Leaf the same way I'd earned Night Watch, one hard, correct call at a time, over years nobody outside that windowless room had ever seen. My new family, I'd stopped putting quotation marks around that word somewhere in the last 18 months, wore flight suits and combat boots and gathered around a holographic map table before dawn most mornings, waiting for my read on the night's intelligence, Rangers, SEALs, Delta operators, the exact category of man my father had spent 3 decades calling a real warrior, and every single one of them listened when I spoke, followed when I gave a call, trusted their lives to my judgment without needing to see a single medal on my chest to justify it. Ryan Cole rotated through my briefing room twice more in those 18 months on 2 separate deployments, and each time the dynamic between us settled a little further into something I hadn't expected. Not quite friendship, not quite the formal distance of rank, but a kind of mutual wordless respect that didn't need explaining to anyone who'd been in that ballroom the night everything changed. On his second rotation, he brought me a patch from his unit. Unofficial, the kind operators trade among themselves rather than issue through supply channels. He set it on my desk without much ceremony. "Figured you should have one," he said, "since technically you've been part of this outfit longer than half the guys wearing the real thing." I kept it in the same drawer as my mother's photograph and my father's letter, which felt, on reflection, like exactly the right company for it to keep. The work itself hadn't gotten easier, and I'd stopped expecting it to. There were still nights that stretched into 30-second increments of held breath, still calls that could go either direction depending on a heat signature 3 pixels wide. But I'd learned to carry the weight of it differently, less like something I had to prove I could bear alone, more like something a whole room of people were bearing together. Even when only one voice ended up on the radio, we weren't a family bound by blood. We were bound by something my father had spent his whole life trying to teach me the value of without ever quite understanding that I'd already found it. Mutual respect built one hard decision at a time. earned instead of assumed. Sam had made captain herself by then, running her own team on the DCGS floor, still occasionally texting me lines she was workshopping for future use. I never told her, but I'd started keeping a mental list. My father and I hadn't spoken since the gala. Not in anger. Nothing so simple as anger. In the particular kind of silence that follows an earthquake, while both people are still working out what still stands and what needs to be rebuilt from the foundation up. Then, on a Tuesday in late autumn, a letter arrived at my office. Actual paper, actual handwriting, my father's, blunt and slightly crooked, the handwriting of a man who'd spent most of his adult life typing reports rather than writing letters. I sat with it unopened for the better part of an hour, my heart doing something uneven every time I glanced at the envelope on my desk. After 18 months of silence, what could 2 pages possibly hold? When I finally opened it, the letter was short, awkward in places, the sentences a little stiff, like a man translating something out of a language he'd never been taught to speak in. He asked, clumsily, about my work, used a few acronyms wrong, the way a tourist mangles a phrase they've memorized without understanding the grammar underneath it. It was clear, reading it, that some part of him was still trying to map what I did onto something he recognized. Still trying to build a version of me he could fit inside his own frame of the world. But near the bottom of the second page, after the stilted questions, there were 2 sentences that weren't stiff at all. I don't understand most of what you do, Gracie, but I understand enough now to know I was wrong for 30 years, and I'm proud of you in a way I don't have good enough words for. Your mother would have told me to write a better letter than this. She was always better with words than me. I read it 3 times. My eyes stung on the 3rd pass, and I let them alone in my office with the door closed, watching a transport plane finish its climb into a sky my father would never fully understand and had finally stopped pretending he did. There was a 3rd page I found, tucked behind the 2nd. Shorter still, the handwriting a little less steady, like he'd written it in a separate sitting and almost hadn't included it at all. I went to the VFW last month. Told the story about the valley, your valley, not mine, for once. Told it right this time. Told it the way the general told it. A couple of the old guys didn't believe me at first. Figured I was exaggerating the way I do. I showed them the program from the gala with your name printed in it. Wanted you to know that. I don't expect anything back. Just wanted you to know I said it out loud, in that room, where I used to say all the wrong things about you. I sat with that page for a long time after I'd finished reading it, thinking about the VFW hall, about the sea of faded uniforms and misplaced pride. About the version of that room that had once made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt anywhere else in my life. I tried to picture my father standing at that same bar, telling a different story this time, telling my story correctly to men who'd spent decades hearing him talk over me instead. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I could picture it clearly, and that the picture didn't hurt the way I might have expected it to. It just felt, quietly, like something settling into place a little late, the way sound sometimes arrives a beat behind the light of something that already happened. I didn't call him that night. I wasn't ready for a phone call yet, and I'd learned, the hard way, not to force healing onto a timeline it wasn't ready to keep. But I did write back. A short letter of my own. 3 sentences, nothing more. I got your letter, both parts. I'm glad you told it right. I'd like to hear you tell it again sometime, in person if you're willing. I mailed it the next morning on my way into work and felt something in my chest loosen slightly as the mailbox lid clanged shut behind it. Not resolution, exactly. Just the sense of a door that had been welded shut for 31 years, finally admitting, however slightly, the possibility of a hinge. I didn't archive the letter. I didn't need my father's understanding anymore. That particular hunger, the one that had driven so much of my life for 31 years, had gone quiet somewhere in the 18 months since that ballroom, replaced by something calmer and more durable. But I understood, reading those 2 sentences, that there's a difference between needing someone's approval and being glad, quietly, to finally have it anyway. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases, opened the top drawer of my desk and set it beside a small photograph I kept there, my mother laughing at something outside the frame. Taken the summer before she got sick. Don't let it break the family, she'd told me. Whatever happens. It hadn't broken. It had just, finally, after 31 years, become honest. I turned back to the window. The transport had cleared the tree line by then, running lights blinking steadily against the darkening sky, carrying people toward places I could see the edges of from where I stood and my father. for the first time in his life, could not because he lacked the courage, but because he'd never been given the coordinates. I'd given them to him now. What he did with them was his to decide. My work waited, my real legacy waited, patient and largely invisible, the way it always had been, the way it probably always would be. I had learned, the hard way, the only way that ever really teaches anyone anything, that my father believed a warrior was measured by the battles fought where the world could watch. I had learned something different. In a windowless room 40 feet underground, in the space of 30 agonizing seconds, more times than I could count, a true warrior is measured by the lives saved in silence, and if you are patient and a little bit lucky sometimes, by the people who finally learn, however late, however imperfectly, to see you standing there the whole time. If anyone out there has ever had their calling dismissed by the very people who should have known better, tell us in the comments how you finally proved them wrong. In this community, every kind of service counts, whether the world is watching or not.